So speaking of changes in college football, and NIL was just mentioned, our boy Josh Pate, I'm not going to show the YouTube clip because it was too long, but he made a very good case yesterday, Jaru, when I was listening to him about one of the biggest changes coming to college football. And one of the things he said was that we're about to enter a moneyball era of hiring coaches. So over the past 10 years, college football has the major programs. Texas A&M was the biggest one, but quite a few others. Alabama started this, was Nick Saban, have decided we need the best coach possible. Let's open up our checkbook for as much money as possible to get whatever coach we can. And if he doesn't work out, we'll give him a huge buyout. That's fine. We'll pay the buyout. We'll corral money from the boosters, and then we'll go just find another great coach. It's not as much of a risk. But now that money is going to be a little bit tighter, and the buyout money is going to matter a little bit more because you need money now for NIL. Now, I know people like to pretend that it's not the same money. It's the same money because this is money coming from boosters. Okay, so you need that money for NIL. Josh Pate had a great argument that we might be entering a moneyball era of coaches where people start meticulously, analytically trying to break down what makes a coach successful and how they can get the best value for a coach. Jaru, here's one area where I disagree with him on that, and I want to know what you think. I think we overvalue the success of coaches and not the infrastructure of the program for why that coach was successful in the first place, if I'm being honest. And
I get what you're saying. But wouldn't the coach be the one building the program and the infrastructure at most places? I mean, I know y'all make the argument like LSU, Georgia, Ohio State, it doesn't matter, which is true. But other schools like a Texas A&M, don't you think Jimbo Fisher is partially responsible for building the infrastructure that would make Texas A&M successful?
I'd have said that 10 years ago. I wouldn't say it now. I'd say that, quite honestly, look, there's a baseline, and Jimbo Fisher, I think, is below that baseline. And the baseline is pretty high. It's a pretty high bar to meet. But I think that if you have a good coach there, not the best coach in the world, but a good coach, I think NIL and the infrastructure of Texas A&M would allow you to win championships there because they just open up the checkbook for any player they want to try to get. So I think the problem is Jimbo Fisher just had an offense.
I get what you're saying. The first thing that comes to my mind when you talk about the Moneyball approach is that, and LSU's coaching search is what came to my mind as well. You pay a lot of money and you get a big name coach like a Brian Kelly, and then your boosters donate more money because they're excited for the brand name coach. If you take the Moneyball approach and you hire, an offensive coordinator from somewhere, you don't really drum up that wow factor of hiring the guy. It sort of makes me think of like a Jeremy Pruitt. Tennessee hires Jeremy Pruitt. Nobody that I know was jumping out of their seat with joy to have Jeremy Pruitt as their coach. Now you take a Josh Heupel who had success at UCF, and a lot of people were excited for Josh Heupel to come to Tennessee. So I think whenever you take the Moneyball approach, you lose that wow factor, big name coach that can get fan bases excited.
Okay, but what if you're at a school like, say, Nebraska, where you just are going to have a hard time? Well, I guess that actually is the opposite. If you're Nebraska, you open up the checkbook to get whatever coach you can because you're not going to be able to lure a lot of players anyway, and you try to find some analytical advantage you can get. But
I really think a lot of times hiring coaches, if you get the big name, even if they just become like a CEO more so than an actual coach, the big name when your program's in the dumps and you need a new head coach, and Wisconsin brings in a Luke Fickell, that can energize a fan base, energize players to want to go there. Versus if you hire a coach who's an analytical mind, sure, but who's excited if you take a quarterback's coach or an offensive coordinator from XYZ school to come be your coach? It doesn't have the same oomph factor that a big name does when you hire a new coach.
So I think more important than a big name, if you're at one of these other schools, is having a coach who has a system that hasn't been figured out. And that's where I think Josh Heupel, because I've always said Tennessee was a little bit limited on what it could do recruiting-wise, and they've always been. So I think the mistake Fulmer made hiring Jeremy Pruitt, Fulmer did that. He thought the principles from when he was head coach still applied. Okay, the reason Phil Fulmer was successful in the 90s was because Ray Goff was coaching at Georgia and Alabama was on probation constantly. and Tennessee was able to go into those states and pluck out some talent. Okay, the minute Mark Richt got to Georgia and the minute Alabama stabilized, Tennessee fell apart. Because you can't just win at Tennessee out recruiting other schools, because other schools have better recruiting bases. I would say Fulmer didn't understand that and hired Jeremy Pruitt thinking the same principles could work. So I would say if you have a cutting edge system as a coach, and I think the hard thing with this is where I think Moneyball or not, the hard thing with the athletic directors now, I think the most important thing is find the coach that has an offensive system that no one's figured out yet. And I mean, that's what Danny White found with Josh Heupel. He knew that no one has figured out this system, and the SEC would have a really hard time adjusting, the same way they did to Steve Spurrier with the fun and gun and the nice. And by the time someone does figure out Josh Heupel's system, he will have built up so much credibility as a head coach that he'll still be able to recruit at a high level.
I think even if you figure out Josh Heupel's system, he can still have success because there's so many ways Josh Heupel's offense can attack you. I mean, they can go over the top. Well, Clemson took that away. Well, Joe Milton nickel and dimed all the way down the field all night. You know, if they take away the middle, then you can still go back over. I mean, you still at some point you only have 11 guys on the field. So if you choose to take away the deep ball, Tennessee will eat you up in the run game, or they'll just throw it over the middle. So I agree with that to a standpoint, and I guess Josh Heupel would probably fall somewhere in between in the Moneyball conversation because he still was not like a no-name guy, but he was more of an analytical coach with a good offensive system. So I guess he would be somewhere in the middle. And honestly, that's probably where a lot of these colleges want to lie, is somewhere in the middle, where you get a guy where, like, nobody was questioning Josh Heupel could win football games. It was just a question if he could do it in the SEC. Well, he brings his offensive scheme and his analytics and the Moneyball-esque part of himself and wins games in the SEC, and now he's a proven, credible head coach. So I guess now that I'm thinking about it, like, my best argument for this would be somewhere in the middle, where you get a guy who isn't a no-name, but isn't like a Nick Saban, but also brings in some of those analytical pieces like you were talking about, like maybe an offense that hasn't been figured out, or even if the offense has been figured out, an offense that can have success.
Right, exactly. Yeah, that's what I think too. I think it's a lot of different factors that go into play, and this is where, and also they can get the type of personnel to run their offense at the school they're at. This is the flaw with Scott Frost. I don't think Scott Frost is a bad coach, but his system depends on speed, and Nebraska's not getting speed. It's funny. Elias just asked, could I see a program at this level doing analytics? Nebraska's going all in on analytics. They're fully embracing analytics with Matt Rule, and don't sleep on that. But to embrace it, you have to know what makes your program uniquely good. So if you're Nebraska, it's craft an offense that hasn't been figured out that is offensive line based. That's what you need to do if you're Nebraska. And
I was just about to say it has to be a culture fit too. Because, like, Josh Heupel is still a Southern coach. Like, he was at UCF. And you think of, like, a Luke Fickell going to Wisconsin. I feel like his personality fits Wisconsin football perfectly.
I agree.
And I think that'll be a good hire too. Wisconsin's another place like Nebraska where it's offensive line heavy, run the ball down your throat. And I feel like Luke Fickell's personality and the way he goes about himself fits that Wisconsin mold perfectly. So I feel like a lot more goes into it than analytics, especially when you're talking about college football more than, Moneyball worked in the MLB because everybody has the same goals and there's really no play style differences or territorial differences. But I mean, if you're comparing like Nebraska football to Miami football, it is world different. And you have to have a coach that can fit that mold and continue with those, I guess you want to call them stereotypes, but that's how those schools are going to have to win football games.
Yep. And don't sleep on the Big Ten is making some moves right now, knowing that, because they just signed that $7 billion deal across different TV networks. They're lapping the SEC in their money. That's why Wisconsin just fired its longtime loyal coach in Paul Chryst and brought in Luke Fickell. That's why Nebraska brought in Matt Rule.